May 1989, Las Vegas, Nevada. On KLAS-TV, Channel 8, the CBS affiliate, the evening news is carrying an interview. The man on screen sits in silhouette, his face blacked out. He calls himself Dennis. And what Dennis says in the level tone of a man describing a former job is this. In the desert north of the city, at a site he calls S4, the United States government keeps flying saucers. He knows, he says, because he worked there. He was hired, he says, to reverse engineer their propulsion. The reporter is George Knapp, a working television journalist who will follow this story for the rest of his career. Within days, the name S4 is moving through the research community, the radio call-in shows, the newsletters, the network you have spent 9 episodes learning to see. By November, the man in shadow has a name and a face, Robert Lazar, a young physicist, he says. Los Alamos, MIT, a hand-picked recruit to the most secret site on Earth. His story comes with a fuel, a substance he calls Element 115. The story will outlive the decade. It will outlive the century. Area 51 will enter the language because of it. Almost everyone asks whether the story is true. Almost no one asks the question this season has trained you to ask instead. Where was the story before he told it? This episode carries a flag, and we say it out loud, now, contested. Bob Lazar has never been charged with any crime. No government authority has ever put an attributable signature on a paper calling him a liar. And before this hour is over, you will hear how strange that absence is in both directions. Nothing tonight is a verdict on a man. It is a file on a story, and on the network the story traveled through.
There's a mistake almost everybody makes with whistleblowers, and I made it for years myself. We test the person, polygraph the man, check his schools, argue about his memory. But a service that wants a story delivered doesn't need a perfect person. It needs a perfect delivery. The package is the person. So the question that actually cracks a case like this isn't, is he lying? It's, was this story already in circulation before he told it, and who was circulating it? That question has an answer. It's documented, and it's the spine of tonight's episode.
Tonight, a living room in Las Vegas where the S4 story was told, 15 months before the broadcast. A radio show with a contradiction in the middle of it, a wrong code name, an element that behaved like a signature, 3 federal agencies that looked away in unison, and a letter. 6 pages, October 1990, in which a cleared technician you met last week reasons his way from first principles to the hypothesis this whole season has been circling. This is the deception thread. Episode 10, The Conduit. Start 15 months before the cameras. February the 6th, 1988. A house in Las Vegas belonging to John Lear, son of the man who built the Learjet, a veteran pilot with time in CIA-linked airlines, and, by the late 80s, one of the most electrifying storytellers in saucer culture. In his living room that weekend, a small audience, John Andrews, the aerospace historian from the Tester Model Company, Ron Regier, a defense support program specifications writer from Aerojet, and Lee Graham, the Aerojet technician whose file carried Episode 9. 3 individuals stood before that group and delivered a briefing. The subject, by Graham's own contemporaneous account, he was in the room, was Groom Lake and a site called S4. February 1988, 15 months before America met a man in shadow calling himself Dennis. 2 details from that weekend, and both will matter tonight. First, 2 of the 3 briefers told the room that Aurora, the famous whispered name for a Mach 6 successor to the Blackbird, was a phony nickname, not the real designation. Hold that. Second, on Lear's coffee table next to a set of KLAS-TV photographs of Groom Lake sat a photograph of an object suspended from a crane. identified to Graham by a man he names in his letter as the Snowbird vehicle. Snowbird. You know that name. It is the project from the Aquarius document family. The paper Bill Moore handed Lee Graham back in 1985, describing a mission to test fly a recovered alien aircraft in Nevada. The same mythology on paper 4 years before Lazar spoke. The vocabulary is older than the witness.
The witness is supposed to be the origin of the story. That's what the word means. Here, the story is demonstrably older than its witness. Same desert, same craft in a hangar claim, same documents, moving through the same few living rooms since at least 1985. 2 readings, and I'll flag both. 1. The underlying thing was real, and it was leaking. Several people picking up the same genuine signal. That's the honest disclosure reading, and the paper trail supports it as much as anything else does. 2. Someone was seeding the ground, placing the vocabulary before the crop came up. What we can document is the pattern of the seeding. Whose hand did it? That's tonight's contest.
How did the material get to that living room? Graham's letters trace a chain, and we flag it as his reconstruction written down at the time. The Aquarius papers moved from Bill Moore, the confessed counterintelligence collaborator of episodes 8 and 9, to Rieger and Andrews. From them to John Lear. And Lear, by this account, showed the material to Bob Lazar before Lazar ever went public. If that chain is right, then before the first camera rolled, the man who would tell the world about S4 had already been shown the network's own S4 literature. Documents descended from an Air Force counterintelligence office. That is the claim. It has never been adjudicated. It sits in dated letters from a man who was in the rooms. There is a second stranger entry from 1988, still before the cameras. Ron Rieger told Graham that Lazar visited Lear's house later that year and briefed him on something called Project Excalibur. A missile, he said, built to punch deep into the earth and destroy underground alien bases. Graham checked. He found Excalibur in Aviation Week and Space Technology, the issue of June the 13th, 1983. It was real, an X-ray laser experiment out of the weapons laboratories. No aliens, no bases. Open source material wearing an extraterrestrial overlay. And the living rooms were connected all the way to Ohio. Ernie Kellerstrass, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel who had worked at the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the building where, in legend, the saucers sleep. In the network's bird-watching code names, he was Hawk. Researchers who knew the pipeline describe him as the primary gateway for material flowing out of Wright-Patterson to the UFO community through the 1980s. In the fall of 1987, at his home in Beavercreek, Ohio, he hosted a dinner. At the table, by the account of one attendee, Bill Moore, Jamie Shandera, the physicist Hal Puthoff, Colonel John Alexander, Robert Collins, and C.B. Scott Jones, an aide to a United States senator. On the menu that night, an alleged extraterrestrial base at Area 51 and a radiation-marked zone northwest of Groom Lake. Fall of 1987, 18 months before Dennis. Now the flags spoken in full because this source needs them. Nearly everything from that table reaches us through the recollections of network insiders, the same category of men episodes 8 and 9 taught you to handle with gloves. And Kellerstrass himself is, by any standard, a contaminated source. A man who claimed, among other things, to have lived with an alien for a time. Flag him contested. What is not contested is the map. The man described as Wright-Patterson's gateway to the believers had at one table the 2 men who released the MJ-12 papers, a senator's aide and the secret desert base story, a year and a half early.
When a source tells you he lived with an alien, you don't keep his claims. You keep his address book. Kellerstrass, the storyteller, is useless to analysis. Kellerstrass, the node, is gold, because whatever his stories were, fantasy, or fed to him, or both, the documented thing is who sat at his table and which way the material flowed. Wright-Patterson to the network. The network to Las Vegas. And the stories coming out the far end of that pipe, desert bases, radiation zones, craft and hangars, are the stories a young man on television will be telling within 18 months. He wouldn't have needed a clearance to know that material. He'd have needed to be standing near the pipe. That's the hypothesis, and I flag it as one. The other reading stays at the table too. Maybe the pipe was carrying something true.
So hold the picture as Act 1 closes. By the day George Knapp's cameras rolled in May 1989, every load-bearing element of the S-4 story, the site, the craft, the test flights, even the insider's detail that Aurora was a phony name, was already in circulation in a documented network among documented people, some of them confessed deceivers. What arrived on television that spring was not, on this record, a revelation. It was a broadcast. The question is what the man in shadow added that the network did not already have. The answer, when Lee Graham went looking, turned out to be almost nothing. Except one thing, and the one thing is the tell. November the 21st, 1989. KVEG Radio, Las Vegas. A call-in program called The Billy Goodman Happening. Bob Lazar, now public under his own name, takes questions on the air, and on the tape of that night, preserved, transcribed, and dissected in the letter this episode is built on, he does two things, minutes apart, that do not fit together. First, he speaks freely about the hypersonic aircraft he calls Aurora, offering performance details, presenting his Groom Lake employment as the source. Understand what that material was. When Lee Graham later asked the Air Force about Aurora in writing, the answer came back in the summer of 1990. Records responsive to that subject were classified under executive order. Lazar's stated rationale was a whistleblower's. The public's right to know came first. He would provide any information, classified or not, to demonstrate he was telling the truth. Then a caller asks a question. Do they keep MiG fighters out at Groom Lake? Soviet fighters, acquired and flown in secret for training. By 1989, their presence in Nevada was publicly documented, printed, sourced, known. Graham would staple the clippings to his letter as exhibits. And the man who minutes earlier had given away performance data on a classified aircraft answers, I can't talk about that. Lee Graham listened to Lazar's broadcast and then wrote his reaction down.
Bingo! Bells went off in my security-minded head.
Run it the way a security officer runs it, because that's who caught it. A genuine whistleblower weighs harm against truth. This man had already crossed the classification line on tape for less. Refusing the MiG question protected nothing. The MiGs were public. There's exactly one framework where that answer makes sense. He isn't weighing harm. He's following a boundary. Allowed topics, forbidden topics, and the boundary doesn't track classification. It tracks a script. In the trade, that's called bounded disclosure. It is the behavioral signature of a managed source, witting or unwitting. One broadcast, one contradiction. On its own, maybe a nervous man being inconsistent. The file doesn't stop there.
Because Graham had a private test ready, and Lazar failed it. From inside the aerospace world, through a colleague's slip in a technical conversation, Graham had come to believe the Mach 6 aircraft's real designation was not Aurora at all. It was Senior Citizen. He had put that name on paper as early as August 1989, page 6 of a letter to the Vice President of the United States, a page that came back bearing an unclassified stamp. And two of the three men who briefed Lear's living room in February 1988 had said the same thing. Aurora was a phony nickname. Bob Lazar, the man who described working inside the most classified complex in America, used the phony name. Graham's argument, and we flag it as his. A real insider can be wrong about many things. The one thing he does not get wrong is what the program down the hall is actually called. Fabrication from seeded materials produces exactly this error. The legend contains what the network gave it, and the network had the phony name. Then there is the clearance. Lazar described holding a security clearance far above anything in the public system, levels beyond top secret, beyond the Department of Energy's queue. And when a federal counterintelligence agent actually looked at the case, Mike Majewicz of the Defense Investigative Service, investigating in early 1990, he told Lee Graham on the record that he questioned Lazar's testimony, quote, on the basis that there are no security levels above a Q clearance. Understand who is speaking. Not a debunker, not a rival. The counterintelligence agent whose job it was to know, saying the clearance the story requires does not exist. And then, the element. In Graham's contemporaneous assessment, and he was positioned to make it, having sat in Lear's living room since February 1988, nearly everything in Lazar's public account was already circulating in that network before Lazar emerged. With Graham wrote, one exception. Element 115. Here is what a single novel detail does inside a managed release. It authenticates. Everything else in the package borrows credibility from the one thing nobody has heard before. The analysts call it a token. That is Graham's analysis, and this show's hypothesis. And even the token carries a question mark. That same spring, the very season the Man in Shadow first appeared, the scientific press was writing about the laboratory hunt for super-heavy elements, element 115, among the entries on the theorist's charts. Whether the number was carried out of a desert base or lifted from a magazine rack is precisely the kind of question this story was built never to answer. The paper record on the man himself cuts both ways, and the show owes you both edges. Los Alamos National Laboratory answered a records inquiry in writing, finding no record of Bob Lazar as a laboratory employee. That is documented, and it wounds the whistleblower reading. On the other side sits a W-2, a real tax document, from the United States Department of Naval Intelligence, a non-existent government agency. And George Knapp, the journalist who broke the story, did not walk away from it. He kept reporting, kept assembling corroboration, and built over years the public case for Lazar. The counter case has a champion and an audience to this day. Which brings the episode to the strangest entry in the whole ledger, the show arguing against itself as promised. John Andrews, the Tester Corporation historian, the most careful analyst in this civilian network, went to Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, a man whose name orbits the Lazar story. Andrews asked him to sign a single sentence: Bob Lazar is a liar. Teller autographed his book for him. He would not sign the sentence. And across every agency this story touches, the same pattern holds to this day. No government authority has ever made an attributable, signed statement calling Bob Lazar a liar. When the Air Force's designated investigator, Colonel Richard Weaver, finally put denials on paper in 1993, he denied something else entirely. He denied that Lazar had ever been a functionary of Air Force counterintelligence. Andrews called that gap the definitive one. The case stays open, he concluded, and he suspected it stays open by institutional design.
Sit with the Teller moment, because both camps claim it. If Lazar were simply a fraud, the believers ask, why wouldn't Teller sign the sentence? And the skeptics answer, eminent men don't lend their names to other people's fights. Lawyers exist. Silence is cheap. Every reading is available. None is checkable. If you followed this season, that should feel familiar. It's what an engineered stalemate feels like from the inside. But here's the piece I can't file away. This is a government that prosecutes leakers with enthusiasm. And it had on tape, on the public airwaves, a self-described defense worker giving away classified flight data. The system has an entire vocabulary for that situation, and the vocabulary is indictments. What it produced instead was silence. And silence, at that volume, is what Act 3 is about.
Lee Graham did what a cleared man is trained to do. He reported it. February the 1st, 1990, a formal report to Defense Investigative Service Agent Mike Majewicz, Bob Lazar on tape, disclosing data on a classified aircraft. February the 22nd, a second report to DIS Agent Xavier Romeriz. And Graham had an older report of his own already in the system. He had been handed classified F-117 stealth material, secret, special access required, that he had no need to know. Handed it, he believed, so that he would leak it. He reported that, too, to Air Force counterintelligence, to the Defense Investigative Service, to the FBI. Bill Moore even asked the DIS, on the record, to interview him about the source. 3 agencies. A reported release of classified material with names, dates, and tape, and on the record assembled here, not one of them pursued it. Graham had also built the logic into a trap, and it is worth hearing sprung. Anyone holding a clearance signs Standard Form 312, a binding agreement to verify, before disclosing that information is unclassified. So, either Bob Lazar held a clearance, in which case the radio broadcast was a federal crime under the espionage statutes, and the machinery of prosecution should have started turning, or he never held one, and the account collapses on its own terms. Both prongs demand a government response. Neither ever came. The analyst's phrasing for what that silence means is careful, and we flag it as hypothesis. Agencies declined to investigate a reported release of classified material in essentially one circumstance, when the release was authorized at a level above their visibility.
In counterintelligence, the fastest way to find the operation isn't to watch what the government does. It's to watch what it inexplicably doesn't do. A leak investigation is close to automatic. It's a machine. You feed it a report, it runs. Somebody has to stop the machine. When 3 separate machines all failed to run on the same case in the same year, the non-event is the event. Flag it properly. Nobody has produced the order that stopped the machines, and absence of action is not a signed confession. What's documented is reports filed, agents named, dates on paper, and nothing. You now know everything Lee Graham knew in the fall of 1990. Watch what he does with it.
September the 30th, 1990. In a community newsletter called Focus, Gene Huff, a Las Vegas appraiser, Bob Lazar's closest associate and public spokesman, publishes a letter dismissing the investigators. Nobody who was actually in the know in Las Vegas, Huff writes, was ever even contacted. For Lee Graham, secretary by then of a small documentation group called the Fair Witness Project, that was the match. October the 18th, 1990, 6 pages. An open letter, Graham to Huff. It opens with the receipts. 3 separate attempts to reach Lazar through 3 independent channels. George Knapp had personally invited Graham to meet Lazar during the F-117 unveiling visit to Las Vegas, and Lazar refused the meeting. Documentation passed through Billy Goodman's radio show. No response. A list of questions sent through John Andrews. Receipt confirmed. No response. 3 channels, 3 closures. That is not privacy. That is systematic avoidance of verification from outside a controlled circle. Page by page, the letter lays out everything you have heard tonight. The legal trap, the MiG contradiction, the phony code name, the clearance that does not exist, the story circulating in Lear's network 15 months early, the element standing alone as the one new thing. 18 months of structured verification from an open-source standing start by a man who had never heard the phrase analysis of competing hypotheses but performed it anyway in 1990 with a filing cabinet and certified mail. And then on page 3, Lee Graham writes down his conclusion. The hypothesis, stated in full, in his own words, 30-odd years before this podcast existed.
I believe that Mr. Lazar is a government intelligence plant, that he has some sort of working agreement with the powers that be, in which he is allowed to talk about some things that are not classified, but cannot talk about things that are.
Now look at where he sent it, because the distribution list is itself a piece of analysis. Senator Claiborne Pell of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Mike Majewicz, Defense Investigative Service, Nicholas Boone, FBI, George Knapp, KLA-STV, John Andrews, William L. Moore, Ron Regier, Don Ecker of the Community Press. Government oversight, federal law enforcement, the story's own media sponsor, the pre-Lazar briefing network, the newsletters, all serve simultaneously so that no single recipient could quietly manage the document because every other recipient already held a copy. A sitting United States Senator, 2 federal agents, the journalist who owned the story, October 1990. And nothing happened. No inquiry, no answer on the record. The silence was the letter's final finding, delivered by the world instead of the author.
18 months in, Graham had the wrong code name, the bounded disclosure, the phantom clearance, the preceded narrative, the token, and the triple non-investigation. And he mailed the whole matrix at once to everyone with the power to falsify it. That's not a hobbyist with a grudge. That's analysis of competing hypotheses without the name, and the method held up for 35 years. And notice the reflex we flagged last week, the honest man as instrument. Whoever built this story got 18 months of free adversarial testing out of Lee Graham. Every hole documented, every question filed through proper channels, and the system never once had to answer him. Integrity, pointed at a stone wall, does the wall no damage at all. It just maps the wall, which, if anyone was watching, was also useful.
The network did not survive its own honesty. January 1991, John Andrews, worn down by the battles Graham's campaign had loosed, ends their friendship in a letter and closes it with 6 words. Sadly, AFOSI is the winner again. And Lee Graham himself? 4 years later, in September 1994, he set down his settled conclusion in a letter to Moore. He did not believe Lazar's S4 account, and he believed the classified activity in that desert was real. A fabricated story wrapped around a genuine secret. The man the operation had chosen as its document conduit in 1987 had arrived, from the inside, at the exact shape this season keeps finding from the outside. Run the grammar across it, one last time. Seed, a snowbird paper in 1985. A dinner in Beavercreek in the autumn of 1987. A living room briefing in February 1988. Amplify, a man in shadow in May 1989. The name S4 in every mouth within days. Radio, television, and eventually the folklore of the age. Manage, bounded disclosure on a call-in show. A phony code name absorbed as gospel. 3 agencies holding perfectly still. Harvest, a generation that looked at the most sensitive test range on Earth. In the very years its real black aircraft were coming out of the dark and saw saucers. So, who benefits? Whoever needed Groom Lake watched by the wrong eyes, asking the wrong questions forever. Whoever needed every future voice from the desert pre-discredited, because after Lazar, Any real defector from that range walks into public wearing, on arrival, a tinfoil hat. And whoever might one day need a public that already believed, a market for desert saucers, primed and waiting. Keep that last one. The season is about to meet the people who monetized it. The deception lesson of the conduit is the gentlest looking in the season and the most dangerous. The most powerful disinformation does not come from a stranger with documents. It comes wrapped in a sympathetic human being, likable, specific, apparently with everything to lose, who may not even know what he is carrying. You cannot polygraph a package. And the counterweapon, demonstrated across 6 pages in October 1990, is not louder doubt. It is structure, hypotheses, tests, receipts, and a distribution list that nobody can quietly manage. Next time on the deception thread. The lone whistleblower was a 1980s technology. What came next had letterhead. A Senate aide, a 30-year naval intelligence man you have now met twice, put his working method in writing to Bill Moore in 1988.
My effectiveness is directly related to being invisible, except to those directly involved in the process.
A briefing at a Rockefeller ranch in Wyoming, a national poll quietly co-funded by a European prince, and a Las Vegas billionaire about to buy a haunted ranch in Utah with a network already assembled and waiting for him. Episode 11, The Infrastructure.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. Remember, we don't teach you what to believe, we teach you how to think. This is the Circle Jerk.